Okay, so we are live. Right, thank you for coming along to today's YouTube Live. We are going to look at mastering mobility and posture without stretching. So how do we do that? We're going to use the nervous system. We're going to talk about the nervous system. For those of you, though, that are here and have never met me before, I'm Adam Cox, and my area of expertise in the health and fitness industry is helping people with poor posture and mobility to regain optimal movement effortlessly using advanced neuroscience techniques. I've been in the industry for 20 years and I have helped over 300 clients one-to-one. I've had the great fortune of being educated by some of the leaders in the industry, the Jack Institute being one, and personally mentored by the developer of Neuro Reset Technique, Simon Frost. I'm also the author of the holistic health book, Back to Brilliant. So before we get into today's webinar or masterclass, what I'd like to just talk to you about is a key idea that I think is relevant, and that is that when we go through stretching routines, you must have experienced this yourself, where you're consistent, you notice an improvement in flexibility, let's say, with what you're working on, hamstrings, chest, some of the typical areas that we work on. And we can be really diligent with those things. And then after a while, maybe you get to a period like we're coming up to now with Christmas or summer holidays, and your routine goes by the wayside. Then you come back to your routine after a period off, and you find that you've gone back to the same level of flexibility and mobility that you had prior to starting your routine and your habits. So that key idea really lies in nervous system function and the fact that we're not improving what's happening in the nervous system when we do a consistent and regular stretching routine. So we're going to aim to address that in today's masterclass. Let me tell you a quick story before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, and that is a story of a client of mine that I worked with for a fair amount of time post-operatively after a full knee replacement. So he'd had a knee replacement, and as a young guy, had a knee replacement. He had regained a decent amount of function after the knee replacement, but he was still struggling to straighten the knee fully. So when he was laying on his back, his thigh was vertical, and he could get his lower leg to about that angle there, so just past 90 degrees. We'd done a lot of work, regained as much function as we could, and I spoke to a colleague who works in the same location as I do, and I asked him whether he had any ideas on this, and eventually myself and the client went along to see this practitioner. The practitioner lay him down on the couch, did his assessments, found that the knee was actually functioning pretty well, the ankle and the hip were both functioning well. So he started to move up the body and look at the spine, the trunk, and the ribs and all the associated areas. Long story short, he ended up doing a treatment on this client around the diaphragm, the large breathing muscle in the trunk here. And then after the treatment, he came back to the knee. So bear in mind, he'd taken the leg, he tried to straighten it up and got it to, the angle that I just mentioned to you. And he, without touching the knee, without having directly worked on the knee, he then just straightened the leg with a few clicks and pops, I have to say, but without forcing it whatsoever. The knee just went bump, almost completely straight. So the angle was probably something like this by the time the practitioner had done what he'd done. The client was laying down at this point. He sat up, mouth open, and said, "What have you just done? How did you do that?" Bearing in mind, we've been working for weeks, working on all the physical things to try and increase range of motion and reduce pain. And this client jumped up off the couch and walked out of the room and said, this feels like a completely new knee, the new knee that I was hoping for when I'd had my knee replacement. So it was at that point that I started my journey learning neuro reset technique with the developer, the person that actually did this treatment. So when we get the nervous system working well, and when it's no longer trying to feed information to other areas that are trying to act like a protective mechanism and hold tension in the body relaxes, the tissues relax, the muscles relax, and things will work much more effectively. So that's an elegant way of addressing posture and mobility. So we've talked about perhaps what not to do. So with stretching, we perhaps don't want to just pull and fight the body all the time with this routine that we perhaps get into that is consistent. You do your consistent daily stretches and you see some small improvements over time, and then you fall off the wagon because of Christmas, because of holidays, life events, and you go back to square one and you have to kind of then get back into that routine. So that's what not to do. The thing that I'd like to talk about, though, like I said, is about the nervous system. The nervous system is controlling all of this tension, all of these postural alignments all the time, and many other things besides, obviously. So to understand how it's doing that, I'm going to give you an analogy. And the analogy is of a map. And imagine you've got your phone screen, but you've got your Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever it is that you use. And in this particular case, the map is fixed on the screen. So the blue dot doesn't stay in the center in this analogy. Okay, so the map of the area that we're in right now is fixed on your screen. Okay, and the blue dot, which tells you where you are, will move up to the edge of the screen all the way around, and that is your current mobile range without any stretching. Okay, so for example, my map of my shoulder is such that my arm can get into this range, this range, this range, and my body has good control over it. That's the edge of my map. All right. If we then take a joint, such as the shoulder joint here, and we do a series of stretches where we're effectively taking that arm beyond the brain's current map of where we are with the shoulder, what we'll find is, yes, we can do that for the short term. We can almost fight the body, fight where it's getting to. But if we don't consistently do that, then what we'll find is after a day, 2 days, 3 days, the body will return back to its base level of tension in that joint, because that's what it can control on its current map. So I want you to keep that map analogy front of mind whilst we're talking about the other things in this masterclass, because this is going to help you really understand A, what we're going to do, and B, why we don't want to be repeatedly stretching if the aim is to achieve long-term results, because the long-term results are going to come from a change in your neurology and your physiology with regards to that. So how do we first of all understand what my current state is in the body? There's a few ways we can do it. We want to use a test, though, I think that's particularly useful, where we put the feet right together. Okay, so you're standing with your feet side by side and your hands out in front of you. This way, I'm going to have very little input from the hips. I'm going to have very little input from the lower part of my trunk here, because if I start to sway left and right, I'm going to fall over. So that leaves me with rotation in my thoracic spine. Okay, so we're going to use this as a proxy for how the rest of the body is doing. So hands go out in front, and we're going to measure rotation to one side and rotation to the other. Now, if you're someone that feels tight, feels like they have bad posture, when you are in that state, you are in your feeling state. Okay, you are aware of something that doesn't feel as you would like it to feel. So you're not necessarily thinking too much. So with this rotation test, I don't want you to get too much into the thinking mind of, I need to be able to go to that point and that point. I want you to ignore where you think you should be able to get to and go within and move nice and slowly and move through a range where you can start to feel the first points of tension in your body and how your body's moving, okay? So for me, if I do that right now, I'm aware that about 45 degrees to my right side and about 45 degrees to my left side, I can feel that the body starts to want to, or I start to want to fight the body at that point, okay? So that's on my map, that's my current mapped range. Great. Now, if we do a test or take a joint or a muscle into a particular position, we can come back to that particular assessment and find, has that range increased or decreased? And then we can understand what's happening with the body there. So, and I'll tell you exactly what to do and why that's happening in a little while. So we've got the standing rotation test. That's going to be your key test to understand your body in any given movement or moment. So whether that's you've been sitting down all day and you want to test yourself relative to your baseline, or whether you've done an exercise and you want to test yourself relative to that baseline, or you've done a stretch and you want to test that against your baseline. Your baseline being your current level of map or your current level of capacity within your nervous system. So there are a series of sensors within tissues all over the body that are going to feed back information to your brain to tell your brain where you are on that map. Okay, so the phone and the map and your Google map or whatever map that you use only works because there are satellites and receivers in your phone picking up that information all the time. And that's the same with the muscles and the joints. Okay, so otherwise we wouldn't know where things are proprioceptively. So those things are called muscle spindles, and they tell us one, position, so where my arm is in space, and also two, when it starts moving, or what we call velocity. We're going to use an example now that's probably quite obvious to you in terms of your body, because a lot of people, when they say, oh, I feel tight, and you mention the hamstrings are one of the things that, you know, people quite often say, oh yeah, I definitely feel tight in my hamstrings. So what I want you to do now, if you can, is to just bend forwards, try and touch your toes, and get a sense of your current level of tension in that position going forwards, okay? This is another way that we can assess how we're doing with regards to the nervous system. And just to use that and then to come back and test against that. So when we think about hamstring tension, what's the first thing that you normally go to? Oh, I need to stretch the hamstrings. So you start pulling on the very muscle that's tight. Let me present this thought process to you though, and see how that changes your thinking. What if the tension in a muscle, in this muscle in particular, the hamstrings, is actually your nervous system's way of maintaining adequate control over that part of the body, i.e. the hip joint and the knee joint and potentially the lower back and pelvis as well. So if the tension is there in the hamstrings to help you with that, then stretching and pulling on these tissues is fighting the nervous system, because the nervous system is saying, hey, according to the sensory information in that area, that muscle needs to be a given length and tension. So let's switch our attention over to the other side of the joint. So if we've got hamstrings down the back, then we want to think about the muscles that are coming down the front here that are doing potentially the opposite job. So that is the hip flexor and the knee extensors, okay? So those two areas, we're going to look to see if we can get better function in those areas as opposed to pulling on an already tight muscle at the back. All right, and then we can go back and we can retest the hamstrings and see how that feels, and also retest that against our standing rotation test. So what we're going to do, we've already bent forwards. We've felt the tension that we feel in the current hamstring position. If you can get all the way down, great. Just make yourself aware of how that feels. If you can't, then just measure with your hands on your thighs, knees, shins, etc., where you get to and what the level of tension is. Okay, so I mentioned two areas that we can work on to pull against the tension at the back, which is the hip flexor and the knee extensors. So think about the thigh muscles and the hip muscles. Okay, if we get better control and better function in those two areas, we find that the hamstrings will regulate themselves and the system will regulate itself and relax off. Okay, so let's test this now. So we stand with our feet together, hands out in front. We slowly rotate around to feel where our first point of tension is in the body. Okay, so we've got about 45 degrees. The first thing I'm going to do, without pulling my leg up using my hand, I'm just going to use my muscles in my right hip to pull that leg up as high as possible. And then I'm going to stand and retest myself. Okay, so my tension actually goes up there. So there's potential for me to treat the right hip. Okay, let's see if we get the same on the left side. Okay, and definitely increases the tension there. So you're seeing a live example of areas that I could definitely do to work on that. So let's take this example. Now, what do? I found that the hip flexors start to cause an issue, and they do something, we call this a neuroprotective response, what you've just seen there. So when the body starts to reduce its range, it's a neuroprotective response because it's saying, hey, you're taking a joint past where I can control it. This is the nervous system speaking. You're taking this joint or muscle past where I can control it. So I don't want you to do that. I'm going to down-regulate everything in the system momentarily. And that's a process called calcium-dependent inactivation. It just means that you can't produce muscle contractions as efficiently as you normally can. And that's sometimes where we get the pain actually from with poor posture. You know, so we start to get muscle tension and tightness, and we feel like we're fighting our own bodies and fighting gravity. That's because we're getting neuroprotective responses going off in all over the place: feet, ankles, knees, necks, digestive system, the whole works. So the neuroprotective response we've just seen in my hip there, we want to get that functioning more effectively. So all I did was I pulled the knee up and put it back down again once. So to get better control and better function in that area, I want to do something called potentiation, which in simple terms is just increasing the voltage in those working muscles. So to do that, we can do 3 simple reps of lifting the knee to chest actively, not passively by pulling. In that sense, there's nothing happening in my hip, so I need to do this actively. And you absolutely can do this laying down on your back, by the way. It's much harder doing it standing, obviously, for obvious reasons. So what we're going to do is we're going to now bring breathing into it. So to get that tissue working most effectively, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the knee up to as high as I comfortably can get. I'm going to breathe out. As I'm breathing out, I'm really focusing on what I can feel at the back here. All right, so this area, glute and top of the hamstring. So breathing out, holding that. Breathing in, I'm going to try and lift that knee a little bit higher. Really focusing on the front now in the hip flexor. Breathe out, make myself aware of the back, holding that same position. Breathe in, see if I can come a little higher. Breathe out. Repeat that process 3 times on that left hip. Okay, and then we can go do the same on the right hip. So first of all, I'm going to go back. Doing something like this or just doing general movements like this will bring you back to your baseline performance of your nervous system. So we can bring the feet back together, we can put the hands out in front, and we can do our baseline rotation test. So there's my 45 degrees, okay? And then I'm going to bring my left hip up, back down again, hands out in front, and I'm going to complete my retest. And I'm now no longer feeling that reduction in range of motion, and I'm able to flex that left hip and not have that protective response going on. So that's fantastic. And I can then complete 3 reps on my left leg, 3 reps on my right leg in that way. And then I would move on to, if I'm dealing with the hamstring, I would move on to knee extension. So that is that motion there of straightening the leg. So if I'm on my back, I would pick the leg up, so nice and straight, and I would literally breathe out as the leg's coming up. Feel the stretch in the hamstring. So if my arm, in this case, is the hamstring, breathe out, feel the stretch in the hamstring, breathe in, thinking about the quads, so the thigh muscles, pulling that leg even closer to my body. Hold position as you breathe out. Think about the tension down the back of the hamstring. Breathe in, pull the leg in again. And you're going to keep repeating that process 3 times and then over to the other side. All right, so once you've done that, you can then test again. You can bring the leg into extension and check your protective response and see if that is looking okay. If it's not looking okay, then we want to maybe go back and make sure, did I really focus on the awareness and the sensation that I was experiencing with my out breath, on the stretch feeling, and when I was breathing in, did I really connect with what was going on the working side? Okay. So assuming you've done those bits, then what we can do is we can mobilize the joints as well. So I'll go back to the hip. The hip is a nice, easy one to do in standing. So we'll breathe out. The brain is focused specifically on the joints when we breathe out. So breathing out, we can bring that hip up, round into a full range of motion, all the way into adduction, abduction. When we need to breathe in again, put the leg down, pause, breathe out, and repeat. Full range. And you can do that 2 or 3 times and repeat on the other side. The knees are a little bit more simplistic because we can really just extend or straighten the knee and flex the knee. So we want to, in that case, we just want to breathe out, straighten the leg, flex, straighten the leg, flex, straighten the leg. And you can go through that process again 2 or 3 times with the out breath being held. And there you've got a bias towards the knee joint itself. Okay, so at this point, we've worked on the hip flexors, we've worked on the quads, we've mobilized the hip itself, we've mobilized the knee to some degree. Okay. We did a test at the beginning, which was that forward flexion test, and we were testing to see what the hamstrings were looking like. Now, you want to, if you've been laying down and you've done this process flat on your back, you can jump up and assess to see how you're feeling as you flex forwards again and come to touch the toes. And what you should find, having not pulled on and tried to pull against that tension in the hamstrings, you should find that you're able to get down either beyond the point on the leg that you measured. So if I only got to my knees, for example, when I first measured, if I only got there, then I'm able to get further. And if I could get all the way down to the floor and touch my toes, I should be able to now get there much more easily. Great. So that's your reassessment. And we're at the point now where I'm open to taking some questions. So if you've been watching along and you've seen me explain the neuroprotective response, how that works, how the nervous system controls muscles and joints using this analogy that we spoke about, which was the map analogy. I'm happy to reply to any questions that you may have. So just drop them in the chat, and I can answer anything you might have there. Okay. So I'm going to jump in and answer a question that I commonly get, which is, how do I do all of this by myself if I don't have your knowledge? Well, the simple way to think about it is this. If you experience tension in a part of the body, I'm going to say the common area again, neck and shoulders. So what do we typically do when we experience tension here? We try and stretch it, don't we? Okay. So in my example of what I would normally do with a client in that situation is, rather than passively trying to pull on a tissue that's already tight, i.e. the brain is saying, no, I want that tension there for a whole host of reasons that probably you don't understand, then leave that tension there, because you don't want to fight what the nervous system and the brain is trying to control. But what we can do is we can pull actively using the muscles on the other side. So anywhere you feel tension, move against it, but actively using the muscles on the other side of that joint. So in the next case, I feel tension here, I pull with these muscles over to that side. And then we can bring the breathing into it, and the breath out is always where we focus on where the lengthening side or the tension that we feel, and the breath in is where we focus back in on the shortening side or the muscle that we're working. So in this particular case, I would breathe out, make myself really conscious of what's happening in the tension that's left side of the neck, breathe in, try and draw myself further to the right, breathe out, hold my awareness again on the tension on the left, and we can repeat that process 3 times. If we then need to, we can go to the right hand side, working on that right hand side in the same way. So if we've not got any other questions at that point, then I will wrap up for today, and we'll see you again on future masterclasses. I hope this has been helpful. And you can always obviously drop comments into other videos on posture and mobility and what have you, and I can answer those questions as and when needed. Okay, thanks for coming and tuning in, and I will see you soon.